This podcast is supported by Neon, presenting Anora, nominated for 6 Academy Awards, including Best Picture, Best Actress, and Best Director. Anora is the most beloved film of the year. Winner of the prestigious Palme d'Or and more awards than any other film this season, Anora has been hailed as pure movie magic and a marvel of filmmaking and acting. Starring Mikey Madison in a revelatory performance and written, directed, and edited by Sean Baker, the choice is simple. Follow your heart. Hi, everyone. As I've been parsing through this year's Oscar nominations over the past week, I noticed a pretty encouraging trend. Between The Substance and Nosferatu, it's a remarkably good Oscar year for horror, which is a genre that's been really famously overlooked and sometimes even disrespected by the Oscars, despite some pretty famous wins here and there. And when I want to talk about genre movies, there's really no one better than my friend, The Ringer's Joanna Robinson. So she's back to join me on this week's podcast to look at this year's nominees overall. We haven't talked on the air about the Oscars since last fall. And then what this big breakthrough moment for horror might mean. We also talk about how Robert Eggers might eventually follow in the footsteps of the likes of James Cameron and Christopher Nolan at the Oscars. And after all of that, you'll hear my conversation with the director of the 10-time Oscar-nominated movie, The Brutalist, also my favorite film of the year. It's Brady Corbet. I'm Katey Rich, and this is the Prestige Junkie Podcast. So I just really wanted to take a moment before we start this conversation about genre to congratulate us both for putting The Substance on that list we did together back when it felt like a real long shot, because look at that weird horror movie that got a Best Picture nomination.
I'm very smug for both of us on that episode. I'm smug for you. You were the Substance driver, so you get all the Substance credit. I can't believe
that it worked out as well. I kind of surprised myself by fighting for The Substance that day.
You fought for The Substance. We were like, kind of like, oh, okay. And then if, I don't know, it was like a month later, Sean and I did an episode. We're like, with respect to Katey, The Substance isn't happening. And then we were wrong. So I love that for you. I'm smug because I was pushing the Wicked narrative. And even if Wicked is like not likely to win a ton of things, it hadn't come out yet. And I was like, many people are saying Oscar nominee Ariana Grande, you know, sort of thing. And so here we are.
Yeah. So, I want to talk about genre and the Oscars because I think it's an interesting topic for both of us, both now, historically, everything. But how do you feel about this Oscar lineup in general? Like, I've been saying in this podcast, it's a pretty good Best Picture lineup. We've done pretty well for ourselves. Everything still feels really wide open. As of, late January, how are you feeling about the race?
The nominees, I'm pretty excited about. I think there's a lot to talk about and a lot of things for us to talk about, specifically this subject matter today. It's very exciting. In terms of the front runner for Best Picture, I am continue to be kind of baffled by.
Oh, this is Amelia Perez. Okay, so you believe that Amelia Perez is the front runner. I guess that's pretty undeniable at this point.
Yeah, and I'm just confused by it. And I'm trying to divorce myself emotionally from it. But it relates to another thing I want to talk about, so I'll bring it back up. But it just feels like a misguided push, and also just really far away. I mean, the ongoing questions you ask yourself, I ask myself when we talk about these things are like, what are the Oscars for? What are we trying to accomplish with the Oscars? Like, are we here to predict what will be the most lasting story? Are we here to reflect what was the most important story this year? Are we trying to shape what will be the most important stories going forward? Like, all of that is in the mix. And for Amelia Perez, I just don't see it ticking any of those boxes right now. So anyway, this is not me. Dear Netflix, if you're listening, I'm not here to purely to bury Amelia Perez. There are things about it. There are Zoe Saldana wins that I'm excited about for preemptively excited for and stuff like that. I'm just kind of confused a bit about where we got with what feels like it's running at the front of the pack this year. How do you feel about that? Are you?
I think a similar way, and I think the question of in addition to what are the Oscars for is what story are the Oscars telling us about ourselves and about Hollywood. And last year there was such an obvious Barbenheimer story to tell about it. The narrative of Oppenheimer was so clear. It was such an easy thing to celebrate from all sides. And this year you're in this position where it's kind of this real hodgepodge of mostly indie, some studio movies. It's still this huge moment of uncertainty about Hollywood in general. But then you've got these top movies. Amelia Perez, I think, has a narrative to it. And, it's got this history-making first nomination for an openly trans actress. But what if any of these movies are telling us something about where we are or where we're going or what Hollywood wants to be? I don't really know. And it's crazy to be at this point in the Oscar race and not even know that part of it. And not for lack of trying on the studio's part, I don't think, but it's like everything still feels so amorphous, which is a weird place to be.
I'm just confused because, and maybe this is a silo that I'm in and I'm unaware of a larger narrative, but from everything I've seen, like, let's say that Emilia Perez stands as part of the resistance Oscars that are here to rally support around the trans community, something that I think is like very important. But from every reaction I've seen from the trans community that has a voice in this space, they're like, this isn't what we want. This isn't how we want to be represented. This isn't the story about our community that we want to have lauded. And so it's like, then who is it for? Is it for people who think they're supporting a community and that community is like, no, actually this isn't what you think?
Well, that's like the Green Book vibe, right? Exactly. It's like the Green Book year. Yeah.
That's exactly what I was alluding to. I was just thinking about Green Book and how like Green Book people are like, we've really done it. And like, did you? So,
well, the thing about Green Book, though, that it's funny that it took me this long to realize it, is like Green Book was the underdog in that year. Like it came in, like everyone thought Roma was going to run away with it. That was like the big horse that like Netflix was backing. Alfonso Cuarón wins Best Director for that anyway. And Green Book is what everyone was like, I know which one I'm supposed to vote for, but actually I love Green Book. So Emilia Perez is really more the Roma in this situation, not like the movie that everyone wants to like vote for because it made them feel good. So the metaphors get kind of mixed when you go to too many different years of it. But I'm starting to wonder if the front runner thing will do it in more than the message behind it.
Oh, that's interesting. Because there isn't that like Green Book alternative, is there? Because, if the, what would you say is the second front runner in your view at this point? Is the Brutalist, right?
I mean, I think the second front runner might be the Brutalist, but the one that I'm wondering if it's going to be the Coda specifically is either Conclave or A Complete Unknown.
Yeah.
Because those are the ones, when you start going to that preferential ballot, and at some point I need to do a proper podcast episode to just have someone on to talk about what the preferential ballot is because it's so confusing. But, the idea that you need the second and third place votes is like those two both feel like they could occupy many, many of those spots.
They could, and it just feels a little late for A Complete Unknown surge. And then Conclave has just felt like so anemic, whereas earlier it was sort of felt theoretically possible. In actuality, it seems like it's not showing up. And so it feels like it's a Brutalist versus Emilia Perez race, and neither is going to make you feel good, and that's okay. Like, Best Picture winners don't need to make you feel good. That's absolutely fine. Yep. But I don't see the easy alternative of, we'll just vote for this other thing. It's not Wicked. Yeah. It's not, I don't know what it is. So
I mean, I'm not letting go of Wicked either. I feel like when something is that big a hit and that popular and like nominated in a lot of places where it needed to be, I guess it tied the Brutalist with 10 nominations apiece. But I think you're right that in so many years we've had the one that's it's supposed to win and then the come from behind surging contender, and sometimes it's the front runner that wins and sometimes it's the underdog, and I don't know which one that would be. And like if it's that spread out, I don't know, then maybe weird things happen and then Nora wins Best Picture. I don't know.
I would love a weird Oscars. We love a surprise, so that could be fun.
Well, it's a weird Oscars partly because of what ostensibly we're here to talk about. We can take as many tangents as we want. Is that you get not just The Substance getting that Best Picture spot, but getting Nosferatu swinging in with its 4 nominations that I think a lot of people wondered if it would get. And what I like so much about this Best Picture lineup is that it's got all that genre representation from all over the place. Like, to me, I think you get a healthy Best Picture 10 when you get a lot of different kinds of movies. You get something for everybody. You get a lot of pictures of what this industry, like on a global level, can do. And that, even though Nosferatu didn't get into Best Picture, I still feel like it kind of represents that. And as someone who talks about genre way more than I do, I know there's plenty of fans who are out there being like, Deadpool and Wolverine was robbed. We can set those people aside. But I think you take this seriously enough to know that like there is a power in making the Oscars a bigger tent than it can be sometimes.
Absolutely. Deadpool and Wolverine does not belong here, but there are, we'll talk about it, but there are some superhero movies that I do think have belonged more in the conversation they even got to in previous years. when it comes to something like Deadpool and Wolverine,
I haven't even seen Deadpool and Wolverine. Maybe I would love it and think it belongs in here. I suspect not.
No, you wouldn't think it belongs here, but I think you would have a fun time at the home cinema.
I probably would.
You know, but I think that with something like Deadpool and Wolverine, that's when we have to like, you know, pull up our favorite Don Draper quote and say that's what the money's for. You know, like they can roll around in their billions and feel fine about it. You know, that's what the money's for Deadpool and Wolverine. But there are other blockbuster films that also make massive achievements artistically, or I don't think Deadpool and Wolverine is a story that is going to sort of haunt us into the future. It's popcorn. But sometimes people serve us popcorn with like nutritional yeast sprinkled on it, and those kind of stories like linger so long. And I think sometimes the Academy, I think it's constantly improving, but sometimes the Academy, because of their perhaps in the past more rigid definition of what an Oscar movie is, ignores these stories that really sink their claws into us, you know, as far as when we think back about what film can do, what story can do. A lot of those stories that linger longer are genre stories. And, you know, and I think that's always worth celebrating.
Well, I feel like you've been making the point this year about Dune Part 2, and which is a movie that was hugely successful. It's a sequel to a movie that won 6 Oscars, only was nominated for 5 this time total, which is the wildest stat to me. And it's not that it's irrelevant in its story about like choosing your leaders wisely. So like, where are we on Dune Part 2?
I'm so, you know, this first bullet point on the notes that I made to talk to you today says in all caps, what is going on with Dune 2, which has been my loudest, like Hans Zimmer invented a new drum for me to bang to talk about this movie because it's like
just getting louder and louder.
Exactly. I just don't understand at all because there's no reason for it not to be a bigger presence here, as far as I know, unless like Denis has like spit in people's food. Like I don't understand. You could talk about timing, like it came out at the beginning of the year. That's something we talk about every year, but it feels, you know, there's always exceptions to that rule. So like, you know, it could have lingered, but like, I just don't understand because as far as my perception is, this was a bigger hit than the first Dune was. And partially that's because the first Dune came out during COVID. Well, the first Dune came out during COVID, so it's like apples and oranges to a certain degree. Yeah. But I remember there being a lot of, at least when we were at VF, there was a lot from the critical, you know, the sort of like higher echelon, slightly snobbier with love and respect. We love our VF colleagues, like critical. Dune is for nerds. Dune is bad. Dune is boring. That's what I remember around the first Dune movie. And by Dune Part 2, everyone seems to have bought in, and they're like, "No, this is a visual sci-fi epic that audiences love, critics love, makes a ton of money, is a technological achievement, has incredible performances from actors who are nominated elsewhere." You know, like it's just it's the whole package. Yeah. And I don't understand what happened to it. I know they campaigned for it. This is just my mystery of the year, honestly.
Well, I mean, the simplest answer, I think, is that Wicked has all of the things that you just said and was newer. And, you know, as a musical is a little bit more of a traditionally Oscar-friendly genre. Like, it's hard to say, like, oh, well, 50 years ago, they gave Best Picture to Oliver, so therefore that's what the Oscars like. Obviously, it's completely different people. But, you know, I do think those, like, genre distinctions over time do still matter. And for whatever reason, it was like there was room for one but not both. Although I think Dune Part 2 getting that Best Picture nomination that I think I had given up on it getting, and many other people had too. There's some staying power there. Like there's something to be said about a movie having the full package in that way, still getting recognized the way that it deserves to.
I think that I'm willing to accept the narrative that Wicked ate Dune's lunch, and that's fine. I just think that, like, as much as I did enjoy going to see Wicked, I just think artistically, Dune is such a higher achievement. So we'll see what happens with Dune Part 3. But I have no high hopes for Dune Part 3 because the material that is adapting Dune Messiah is so weird that I was just like,
everyone keeps saying.
I was like, this was the best chance. Dune Part 2 was the best chance for this achievement from Denis.
They haven't started filming it the way they had for Dune Part 2. Like, it may be years before we see that movie.
I remember at the beginning of the year when we saw Dune Part 2 and I was, we were talking about what else could possibly beat it for Best Picture, because we know nothing at the beginning of the year. And I remember everyone I was talking to saying, no, they're probably going to Return to the King it, like they're going to wait for Part 3. And that's that's when I was saying, you can't bank on a Return to the King moment for Dune. It gets so weird. So, we'll see. We'll see what happens.
Well, are you asking yourself the same question about Wicked Part 2? Which, I've never seen the Wicked show. That, my first visual experience of Wicked was the movie. And everyone says Wicked Part 2 is weird and maybe less popular than the first part.
It's just darker. It's just much darker. So, I don't know.
Part 2 is darker in its own ways, I guess.
It's darker in a way that Dune was always sort of dark and gritty, whereas Wicked Part 1 is, Act 1, and we're just having a great time, and the monkeys are scary, but mostly we're having a great time. And then Act 2, find out everything is tough. And so I have some questions about Wicked for Good, aka Part 2, but
excuse me, yes.
I mean, we will see. We'll see.
Will we be living in America in its find out era? Maybe it'll be so relatable that we'll find ourselves finding a lot to relate to there.
Grim but true.
Oh, man. So then The Substance, which is the other huge genre accomplishment in the Best Picture 10. I feel like there's been so many times, especially when you and I were at VF, kind of watching the post-Oscar So White era of the Oscars changing, where there'd be I thought this was too weird for the Oscars, but I don't know, they're changing. And then The Shape of Water wins Best Picture, and then Parasite wins Best Picture. And Black Swan, going back to 2010, is a pretty out there and gross movie. Does The Substance break new ground in terms of what is too weird and gross to make it at the Oscars?
I think it is because it's body horror. I think it's, though I guess Silence of the Lambs was to a certain degree body horror, but it is a step beyond. But so was, Everything Everywhere All at Once is in body horror, but that was a step beyond pushing the boundaries of that genre, what had been previously nominated. So I think we're up for pushing on boundaries. Of course, as everyone who talks about the Academy Awards has been talking about the last few years, we need to take it, the sort of international vibe into account. And then, of course, it's so much the Demi narrative as much as it is the Substance narrative. I'm as much as I love The Substance, I'm tempted to believe that if it had not been Demi and the personal story of Demi as a, quote unquote comeback movie star, someone who in her own life has gone through different eras of plastic surgery that have been more successful than others. There is a personal, we relate to this. There's a personal, this is about aging under the spotlight, that a lot of people in Hollywood can relate to. So it's a Demi story. It's a story about celebrity and Hollywood. And it
Hollywood
also happens.
Loves a movie.
They do. They Is
it the only movie about Hollywood? I mean, I guess The Brutalist is a metaphor for making a movie in some ways, but I think The Substance is of the Best Picture nominees, the only one that's about Hollywood in some way.
Overtly about Hollywood. Yeah. I think that's true. Yeah. I was thinking about this a lot when I was thinking about Shape of Water. I remember that year, and I remember we were in this New York. I wasn't in New York, but the podcast, our Little Gold Men podcast, was in this sort of New York bubble. And then we went out to LA for some reason. Everyone in LA was talking about Shape of Water. Everyone in LA loved Shape of Water. And it was because felt like it was about a love of cinema ultimately. As bizarre as that may seem, that's sort of the narrative that took shape around that film, is that this is a movie about loving movies. And that is catnip to the Academy. So, yeah.
Well, and that wasn't what the movie Oppenheimer is about. But when you have Christopher Nolan, who is this revered auteur who hadn't gotten his recognition, who's this bastion of the studio system, having a little bit of that be part of your narrative in some way, it never hurts for an Oscar movie.
Yeah, and I think I was thinking about Nolan a lot when I was thinking about doing this show with you, because, obviously there's something like Dunkirk, but for a lot of Nolan's career, he's been doing these big movies that are technologically innovative, that make a lot of money, that people love, but are a little too genre, maybe for, you know, if you do Interstellar or Inception or The Dark Knight or any of that, the Academy's like, oh, we can't, and then he does Oppenheimer, like, oh, thank you. Thanks, Chris, for giving us a movie that we can just push
Dunkirk like laid the ground flat, and then he just landed the plane right there for Oppenheimer.
Exactly. They're like, thank you, Chris, for finally giving us a movie that we can just dump a ton of Oscars on your head for. So yeah.
Well, will that be Denis Villeneuve's story at some point? Because something weird, Amy Adams doesn't get the Arrival nomination. Denis doesn't get nominated for either Dune movie. Like, his movies get Oscar nominations, but then weird things happen. So is he going to have to go back and make another Prisoners to get what he deserves?
Not even Prisoners. I'm going to, Denis, if you're listening, and I hope you are, we're going to need a sort of meatball down the middle story of a great man in history. That's what we're going to need. Okay.
I never saw Enseigne, so that was his big French-Canadian breakthrough that I feel like was more sentimental. So yeah, maybe that's what we need to get at. I mean, I have a similar question about Robert Eggers now that he has had, something of a Oscar breakthrough with Nosferatu. I think of him and Ari Aster as kind of this twin set of the new horror masters. They make really interesting movies for big budgets, whether or not they actually make any money, and kind of follow their own North Star. And Robert Eggers has now broken through with Nosferatu at the box office as well as with the Oscars. So it kind of feels like he's now carrying this torch in this way for this younger generation. And I'm curious about maybe how long it takes him to get that Best Director slot too.
Yeah, that's interesting. I was thinking the big narrative around quote unquote elevated horror, though I used the phrase elevated horror in front of some horror creators once, and they got really angry about that phrase.
People get so mad about it. I don't totally understand. I won't use it because I don't want to make people mad, but I don't really get why people get mad about it. But anyway, I
think it's. I guess the connotation is all other horror is sort of schlock. I guess.
Sure.
I don't know, but
which we do not believe.
We don't. We are putting scare quotes around elevated horror, but the Toni Collette for Hereditary sort of narrative, or snub if you prefer, I think was the last time I remember this. Do the Oscars respect horror conversation spiking as hard as it kind of is around this? It's so funny because you and I are celebrating Nosferatu, as we should, for getting 4 nominations, because we were like, this is astounding. I was beyond my wildest dreams. And then I was just reading a bunch of, there's an op-ed in the New York Times. There's a bunch of stories about horror in the Oscars where they were like, what a horrible snub for Nosferatu. And I was like, I was so confused. I was like,
I read that New York Times op-ed too. I did not realize it had reached the level of New York Times op-ed outrage with this nomination.
I was stunned by that. I was like, this is a huge wait. Okay, all right. Let's keep asking for more. Why not?
I think that's a good point.
But Robert Eggers, having made The Lighthouse, The Witch, The Northman, that nobody really felt like they could wrap their arms around, and then with Nosferatu, he has adapted one of our most iconic pieces of film history. Sean and I were talking about this a bit on The Big Pick when he was talking about Wicked as IP. And I was like, sure, Wicked is IP, but Wicked is IP that calls back to one of the most important, popular, beloved, old, glorious Technicolor Hollywood movies. And John Chu isn't intentionally baiting that with the title card of Wicked.
The title card designed by the same designer who did Nosferatu.
Exactly.
He had his own New York Times feature about him, which was fascinating.
Perfect. So Nosferatu, when we think about images of early days of cinema, 1922 Shadow of Claws on the Wall is one of the most indelible, iconic cinematic images. And so he's doing horror, yes, and there is some hardcore body horror in Nosferatu, a film I loved, but it's really also something that is connected to film history. And so I think it gives it an edge over some of the things that, what Ari Aster is doing with Midsommar, etc., is really energizing a new generation of cinephilia almost, I think, which I think is incredibly important. And then similar with Robert Eggers, and then what Robert Eggers has done is just found that note to pluck that hits both the sort of, young cinephiles, horror files, all that sort of stuff like that. And the Academy's like, yes, we know German Expressionism. We can talk about that as well. So, Yeah,
it's a good, because Babylon proved to us that if you link back to old Hollywood history, it's not always going to make it a success. But there is that legitimacy, that idea of like kind of wrapping yourself in this cloak of 100 years of history that really can go a long way. And also like Robert Eggers has this like earnestness in what he does. And like I think Ari Aster does too. But like Robert Eggers makes movies that are scary, but it's not like messing with you. It's just like really immersing you into this world. And like the crafts of Nosferatu are incredible. Like I'm so glad they got those nominations because they deserved every single one of them. It's not just because the movie's popular. Like it's gorgeous. It is that full package, like we were saying before.
As you know, I was just rewatching all of Francis Ford Coppola's movies for the Screen Drafts podcast, a show that you and I love to pop on every once in a while. And Bram Stoker's Dracula is like sort of a similar feat in that, and you know, which won the costuming Oscar and stuff like that. Like you know, in its production design, it's like maximalist, lush costume and production design and all that sort of stuff. It's like we are doing Dracula, a story you've seen a number of times. Nosferatu is just Dracula, just with a different name. You know, we're just doing Dracula, but we're gonna do it with such artistry because it deserves it, you know, and with love and respect to another Nicholas Hoult vampire movie, Renfield. Like that's not always the case. Sometimes it's not. We're gonna, you know, put everything we have into this. So yeah, I
gotta say, I had known my whole life about Nosferatu and Dracula, obviously as separate things, but I'd like until the new Nosferatu came out, I didn't realize it was like basically a copyright infringement from the 20s. Like that it was just wholesale ripped off. I had no idea like how blatant it was. And, like I love that like we still have both. Like we're just gonna have two almost the same but not quite the same origin stories, and that's just how it's gonna go.
It's so funny.
I mean, you talked about Bram Stoker's Dracula. Like, throughout Oscar history, there have always been, like, the exceptions. Like, the horror movies are like, okay, we're going to go with this. We're going to give Best Actress to Kathy Bates for Misery. Or, like, Get Out's going to get a Best Picture nomination. And, you know, Jordan Peele's going to get in. But it always kind of feels like an opening the door a crack and being like, okay, like, we'll allow this one, but not the next one. And I don't know that that's ever going to change. Like, I feel like everything that breaks through the way that The Substance of Nosferatu did has, like, a little extra thing. And it's hard to know what the thing is going to be, but that's always going to be what it takes to cross the threshold. And like something like Longlegs can be like a really big hit and come from a great studio and have everything going for it, but it's just not going to make sense in the same way.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, and in an ideal world, that should be true for all Best Picture nominees, that they should be not just, you know, competent but extraordinary inside of their genre, and then have an extra layer of something, be it a narrative chord that strikes the times we live in now, or this, that, or the other thing. There always should be a story, and that doesn't always the case. Some things just get sort of like greenlit all the way through, you know, just because it feels like it should be. But what I like about
less and less these days, I think.
Yes, that's true.
Sure.
But I think with genre movies, which do always have to sort of prove themselves a little bit more, then it just gets like a bit more exciting because they're like, this is really Nosferatu. I'm just so thrilled. And The Substance, both. Like those two movies feel like some of the movies that people are most excited to talk about last year.
Yeah.
You know, and whether or not it's because they were surprised by them or I don't know, but just like when I go around talking to people, whether or not they're in our industry or, you know, just casual fans, those are the movies that have sort of, you know, and Dune Part 2, by the way, are the movies that got them really excited last year. Yeah. And, you know, Emilia Perez or The Brutalist are also of interest to various circles, but less that sort of like, it's more, well, with Emilia Perez, honestly, a lot of confusion, but also like, you know, certainly there are plenty of people who have talked about how they thought that film was really important. With The Brutalist, it's sort of awe at the achievement, you know, there's like reverence for what The Brutalists achieved, but that sort of effervescence, like excitement,
the idea, you know, the energy that makes you want to own it and make a meme about it. You know, we talk about memes and talk about how Oscar voters don't see them, but I do think they are an interesting gauge of enthusiasm, even if they're coming from people way outside the actual voting world.
And that, I mean, that's what Barbenheimer was. It's like sort of, oh, don't we want everyone excited, whether or not it's because they want to dress up or not, who cares, to go to the movies. We want people excited to go to the movies. So,
yeah. Well, and you are my like TikTok whisperer usually. Like you know what people are talking about on the internet that I don't understand. Like, what is there anything else that you were seeing enthusiasm wise besides Amelia Perez backlash and then Conclave memes? I don't know if we're still doing those, but we had those for a while.
I deleted TikTok. So I am.
Well, good for you.
On the one hand, yes. And on the other hand, I'm like, I really had a moment. I was like, do I need it? Because I did feel like when
No, I
mean, especially when I was talking to like you or Joe or Chris or whatever, and I, you know, we were talking about things. I was like, well, here's my perspective brought to you by TikTok, which was slightly different from the perspective that you had, you know, and it's not, one is not more legitimate than the other. It's just sort of like, yes, people are talking about it over here on this platform. So the last I checked it on TikTok was sort of at the end of last year when the Nosferatu memes were flying fast and furious. So I don't know what January has brought for TikTok other than political drama. So yeah,
no, that's true. I mean, it might all be overshadowed by political drama, but I do find the like when the Conclave memes started in like October when the movie came out, like it warms my heart in such a specific way. That idea of people like wanting to engage with these movies that I care about so much. And that's why like the whole weekend of Barbenheimer last year, I was like emotional being like, everyone's going to the movies. I can't believe it.
I know.
And so the Oscars care about this stuff a lot. Obviously, they want people to care about the Oscars or on social media just like anybody else. So I don't think you can make their 10,000 voters rally around a popular genre movie to make things like that possible. But like, I do think they know that when Nosferatu scores big with them, that is a net gain for them. That like when they can get those movies in the tent, it helps everybody.
I really agree. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so I asked you to come prepared to look back in history, and we're going to talk about when the Oscars get genre right and when they do not.
Yes.
And because I feel like, again, like we understand the people who get mad about snubs, but also we understand that it's an ever-flowing river, and you never know when it's going to work out in your favor. So what did you come thinking about?
Well, in terms of like what the Oscars really, really got right, and under the bigger tent of genre, we've been talking about sci-fi and horror, but fantasy belongs under there. And I just think
totally.
The Return of the King moment is an important thing that the Oscars got right. And I think there should have been a similar moment for Star Wars. I don't know when that, maybe around Empire or something like that, but there should have been a similar, like, because Star Wars, Lord of the Rings, a trilogy of films that I personally rewatch every single year, but of course I'm in the tank for it, but that's fine, is a cinematic achievement that lives in people's hearts and is something that they revisit and rewatch and matters to them. And I'm so glad that the Academy is like, yes, and this matters to us too. Similarly,
when they can recognize it in the moment, right? Yeah. Like, because sometimes those things will live on forever. And like, how would we know that the Pirates of the Caribbean would be one of the most memorable franchises of the mid 2000s? And like, but they couldn't have known that at the time. So for the Lord of the Rings to be so big, then everyone be like, this will happen. That's rarer than I think people who don't invest in the Oscars that much realize.
And I would love for Star Wars at some, obviously not all of it, but Star Wars at some point to have gotten that because it's so important for cinematic history, something like that. But I, and I was thinking about you. Well, actually, when I was thinking about Chris Nolan and Oppenheimer being like the moment, I was thinking about Jim Cameron, like, and your fave Titanic. And I was like, that was another moment, like Jim Cameron, the like nerdy sci-fi guy, makes Titanic and they're like, here, take the Oscars, please take them all.
And Christopher Nolan is like, I see. I know the path now.
Oh, okay. Something horrific that's happened in history. I could do this. But yeah, so I would say Return of the King is something that they got incredibly right. And there are moments here and there that you mentioned, like I was looking at the Mad Max Fury Road year. Of course, Mad Max Fury Road won a ton of Oscars, but like misses out on the big win. I love Spotlight, which won that year. I love that film, but in terms of like the long lens of cinematic history and what we remember, is Spotlight something that we're going to remember the way that we're going to remember Fury Road? And again, you can say that's what the money's for. Or like Brie Larson winning for Room over Charlize maybe winning as Furiosa. Like that's something that I'm like, that could have been really cool with love and respect to Brie and Room, which I really love. And again, like, I don't want to say we shouldn't reward films like Spotlight or Room. Like, I want those movies to exist. I don't think it should just be big blockbuster cinema that wins. But Furiosa is such a, is such an a vital cinematic presence. And Charlize obviously like has an Oscar already, but like, you know, that's something that I think about a lot. Or like Get Out at the Oscars, like we all thought it was a huge achievement, obviously, that it got nominated in Best Picture, that Jordan Peele wins. Shape of Water, like if we're going to reward a genre film that year that feels urgently about the times we live in now, would it not be Get Out over Shape of Water?
Although
you know,
hang on, that's 2017 Oscars, right?
I think so, yeah.
Hang on, I'm going to Wikipedia right now because that year looms very large for me in our recent memory, because you've got like Call Me by Your Name and Lady Bird, you've got
there was
Phantom
a lot going
Thread.
on.
Like it was a really good Oscar
really
year.
Good year.
So it's
yeah.
like I don't know that I would pick Shape of Water, but I think I would like really struggle. Like, you know, Greta Gerwig still has no Oscar. Let's think about that. So let Jordan Peele keep his Oscar and then add one for Greta Gerwig in there. We could do that.
I'm not opposed, as you know. I'm not opposed. Last but not least, and this is the biggie, and you already mentioned it. Green Book year. On the Green Book year. Aromas in the Mix, of course. Bohemian Rhapsodies, blah, blah, blah. But Black Panther's right there. And I know that I wrote a book about the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And so some people may be listening to me and like, go back to your superhero podcast, Joanna. But like Black Panther, I'm not saying every Marvel movie. I'm saying Black Panther was an achievement. And if we want to reward a film and meet the narrative of the time of like, let's talk about what it means to be, you know, a Black person in America or a Black person under the spotlight or all that sort of thing, and we do Green Book over Black Panther, I will just forever, ever, my favorite Oscar reaction gif of all time is, if you recall, Chadwick Boseman looking over his shoulder at Michael B. Jordan with a real told ya look when Green Book won.
I thought you were going to do Spike Lee on the VF Oscar party carpet saying it's not my cup of tea. Close second, maybe?
Yeah. That's up there. But Chadwick Boseman just being like, what did I tell you? Of course they're going to give it to Green Book, you know? But it's just like, Black Panther's right there. And I understand the squeamishness around awarding superhero movies, but they really went way harder than they needed to with Black Panther.
Well, I was going to bring up the MCU, honestly, because like, you know, the MCU is not over. We're going to get more of them. But I think the period in which it was the dominant cultural force in Hollywood is over. I think things have shifted enough. So if we're looking back at this distinct period between the release of Iron Man and Avengers Endgame in 2019, I guess, that was the moment to do it, right? Like if the same thing as Star Wars and Lord of the Rings are saying, if you're going to use the Oscars to acknowledge something that is a huge cultural force, that was the one to do.
Endgame really, like, I have Endgame on my long list, but if I had to pick a superhero movie or two to award, I would pick Logan and Black Panther over Endgame in terms of like...
Well, Logan did get that screenplay nomination for our friend James Mangold. Yeah,
and, you know, Black Panther won 3 Oscars, so it's not like the Academy didn't acknowledge it. It's just sort of like, you know, it's the Mad Max Fury Road thing. The Mad Max Fury Road year when they just kept winning, but it was all below the line, and then once it got like quote unquote serious, we're not allowed to award that film, and it was just sort of like, you know, okay,
it might happen for Wicked this year. The MCU thing I was going to throw in though was for Avengers Endgame. I remember when there was a very brief FYC campaign for Robert Downey Jr. for that movie, and they were saying this is the way to acknowledge it, get him in for Best Supporting Actor. He has been the linchpin of this whole thing. I feel like that should have happened. Like, that would have been, like, he won an Oscar for Oppenheimer. It's all worked out. I think he's wonderful in Oppenheimer. I wouldn't take that away. But I feel like a nomination for him playing Tony Stark would have been very well deserved and a really good way to acknowledge that enormous movie right before the pandemic changed movie theaters forever. It was kind of the last thing we had before the wheels fell off.
I agree. I mean, especially if he can get nominated for Tropic Thunder, why can't he get nominated for playing Tony Stark? You know?
Well, the fact that like he was nominated for Tropic Thunder the same year, that was the same year as Iron Man, right? It was like a real, like, you're back, but we're not ready for this other thing yet. And like he wins. How many people have won Oscars for roles that really have nothing to do with what we remember them for? It's a, you know, tradition as old as Hollywood. But
I was just thinking about this because House of R this week is doing it's a 10-ish, the release dates are funky, but a 10-ish anniversary of Ex Machina. So I was rewatching Ex Machina and just thinking about the fact that Alicia Vikander won for The Danish Girl, but really she won for Ex Machina. Like really that they just didn't felt weird about giving her, but like That's what she really won for.
You know what we should do? I'm going to shoot my shot on the air because we're talking about how we're going to have to do some like flashback episodes in the future. Should we do an episode on like the top 10 won the Oscar for the wrong performance examples?
Yes.
I feel like that's like exactly the kind of thing you and I think about all the time.
Colin Firth, the single man. That's what he should have won for.
Well, that's a classic example of like you get the nomination that's then setting you up for the win. Like they're not right. And I don't know who that's going to be this year. It's hard to see.
But the nomination that just like loosens the lid on the jar a little bit.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's like we brought you in here. We got you teed up for when you're ready.
Yeah,
like Margaret Qualley this year didn't get nominated, but it's like, okay, she got the Oscar buzz so that the next time she's really good, it's happening.
Yeah.
You watch it all the time. Okay, Joanna, I could talk to you about Oscars all day, forever,
every day.
And we'll continue to do so. Thank you for coming back. People should listen to you on all of your podcasts. And then, we'll have you back here to talk about whatever obscure Oscar history we decide to dive into. Limitless field.
I would love to any day. Katey, you're the best. I love you.
This podcast is supported by Neon, presenting Anora. Nominated for 6 Academy Awards, including Best Picture, Best Actress, and Best Director. Anora is the most beloved film of the year. Winner of the prestigious Palme d'Or and more awards than any other film this season, Anora has been hailed as pure movie magic and a marvel of filmmaking and acting. Starring Mikey Madison in a revelatory performance and written, directed, and edited by Sean Baker, the choice is simple. Follow your heart. My guest, Brady Corbet, has spent the last 6 months getting used to something that every filmmaker probably hopes for, but isn't necessarily always ready for, which is talking about your movie that many, many people love. The Brutalist is nominated for 10 Oscars. It's one of the most critically acclaimed films of the year. And Brady, as you will hear, is not the kind of person who's just going to give a short and pithy answer to any of your questions, especially when it's about a film as complex as this one. We didn't actually spend that much time talking about The Brutalist itself. It stars Adrien Brody as an architect who flees Europe after the Holocaust and builds a new life in America. You've probably heard about it. Guy Pearce and Felicity Jones, also Oscar nominees, are excellent in it. But when I talked to Brady, we got into so many other things about what he's been thinking about since making this movie and now promoting it, about the state of the indie film world and what it takes to make uncompromising movies like the ones that Brady still plans to keep making, how to navigate challenges like limited budgets or even AI. You might have heard about that as connected with The Brutalist. We talk about it. And then why Brady wants to be the kind of director who is willing to say things that are maybe controversial if he believes they're true. But that's also unless he can be the kind of director like Terrence Malick, who doesn't give interviews at all. I think he's still figuring out how to get to that spot. I'm a huge fan of The Brutalist, as you probably know, and I'm kind of in awe at how kind and generous with his time Brady continues to be, even after so many months of talking about this movie. And hopefully you'll agree. You can hear my conversation with the director and co-writer of The Brutalist, Brady Corbet. You've been making films for a long time, but you've really never had this experience where you make a film and then you talk about it for months and months and do this promotion. And it's obviously a pleasure to do it, but it's got to be a lot to get used to where you're living in the past and the future and the near future all at the same time.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty similar to what I've experienced in the past, other than the fact that, normally the run for a film that is not doing an awards campaign is about 3 months.
Yeah.
And this is like 7 months. Mm-hmm. And I also am just coming off of another production, a film that I co-wrote and produced and was directing second unit on for my partner Mona, a musical we shot this summer. So I was shooting with her during the day and then finishing post on The Brutalist at night. And then we premiered the film in Venice, and I had promised my daughter that we'd have a few months off, and that's absolutely not what happened at all. Things really ramped up.
Yeah.
I mean, I've been on a plane every 3 or 4 days for months.
Yeah. Is that how your brain prefers to work, of having, you and Mona work on your projects together, you're each directing different ones. Do you feel like having 2 or 3 plates in the air at once, is that how your brain tends to go, that you've got a lot of ideas going at the same time?
I think it's too much. Right now it's too much. Sure. So I'm just trying to, get to March 3rd. Mm-hmm. And Of course, I'm happiest when I'm working, and essentially filmmaking it's a lot of problem solving.
Yeah.
And so you have to sort of be interested in puzzles if you're going to do the job effectively. So, I like producing for other people. I like writing for other people. The reality is that in my lifetime, I'll probably only make 7 to 12 films if I'm really, lucky. And that's just because of how I make them.
Yeah.
They're very radical films, and they're very uncompromising movies. And even though, obviously the success of this film will help to bolster all of that, if you have the desire to really push yourself and evolve creatively over the course of your life, it means that you're taking bigger and bigger swings, bigger risks. Financially, the one sort of trick that I have up my sleeve is that I feel that I'm able to deliver films at a relatively modest budget level, which really allows me and my team to have the autonomy that we need. I am not particularly interested in works that are made by committee or evaluated by committee. I have frequently sort of compared it to something like an exquisite corpse, where you end up with, a figurative drawing that doesn't make any sense. And in the same way that your mother at the holidays would tell you, get out of the kitchen, like this isn't, it's really as simple as that.
Yeah.
And when I pick up a novel, of course I want to hear from that voice. And so, what producing and writing for other filmmakers allows me to do is it allows me to work for them. It allows me to produce more work in my lifetime than I possibly could as just a filmmaker.
Yeah.
I think that, over the next few years, we'll be supporting a lot of other people's projects as well.
Yeah. I mean, for months before The Brutalist came out, I think you were saying, look, I think large format is the future. I think if you take a big swing, I think what audiences want is something they haven't seen before. And that gamble has paid off so much. And I'm really curious about what it's been like. It's obviously Brutalist is still in theaters. It's, it hasn't made $1 billion worldwide yet. It might still. But what's it been like kind of watching that pay off, watching like what you said be proven right, and what does that give you going forward? What are people listening to you say now that they maybe wouldn't have a year ago?
It's hard to say. I mean, I'm still very much in the midst of all the, hoopla that surrounds, campaigning and a promotional tour for a film that, is being released all over the world at the same time. Yeah. I mean, normally that happens over the course of, 9 or 10 months. And it's all happening within, the release is global within 3 or 4 weeks, because every territory is trying to capitalize on, these award ceremonies and the conversation that's generated around them. But, I think that I'm sure that the conversation will be different for a little while. And then, 18 months later, people forget these things, and like you're like Sisyphus, like pushing these like boulders up a hill all the time. And I think that what I plan to do is use, the next 18 months or so to build a stronger foundation for our work that is just more sustainable. Yeah. Because I'm really overworked at the moment, and I have been working 7 days a week for the last 3 years, if not the last 4 years in one way or another. And, of course, I can reflect on my sort of melancholia during COVID, when all of us were wondering if we would, ever work together in the same way again. So, I'm hoping that there is, of course, a happier medium between that and this.
Yeah. I mean, you've spoken really eloquently about how hard it is to be an artist, and even with a level of success, like people who are promoting, Oscar campaigns, but are having trouble paying rent. And when you say a more sustainable basis to do your work, like, does it take this kind of like huge event to make it sustainable? Like, do you have any kind of vision about how to make it more possible for you or people to be artists going forward?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think I have very, very nuanced philosophies about that. I don't know how interesting or compelling it would be for your listeners. But I mean, it has a lot to do with what one prioritizes when building a budget.
Oh,
And I think that there is sort of a status quo that is highly dysfunctional, and doesn't serve the film industry and ultimately doesn't serve the filmmakers, because sand is being moved around in the box in a way that doesn't make a lot of sense. So I'll give you one specific example. So the budget for The Brutalist, its gross number is lower than the gross number for Vox Lux, right? So The Brutalist was made for $10 million and Vox Lux was made for $11 million on paper. However, when I made Vox, I had 22 days to shoot the film, which is, even for a screenplay that's not as long as The Brutalist, is disturbingly little amount of time. And that's because we only had a $4.5 million production budget, and we had a $1 million budget for post. And the rest of that money was misspent for a variety of reasons, because of the powers that be that were on that project. On The Brutalist, our production budget was, closer to $7.5 million. And also we were shooting in Budapest, not shooting in New York City, where there's so much red tape.
Yeah.
And so, that money just went a lot further there. And it went a lot further because the money it was all going on screen. And so I think that, the gross number is not really, how people should be evaluating these projects, because you get to that gross number with a tax credit or, various soft monies or regional support. But what really matters is how everything that's below the line is being spent and where it's being spent.
Yeah.
And so if you have a great line producer that understands, what the pillars of the project are, and if you were working with a financier that allows a line producer to do their job effectively, which is a big factor as well, then, sky's the limit. And I think that with this film, it's a 170-page screenplay. It's over 3.5 hours long, which means that you're essentially shooting 2 movies, not one. And it was shot and premiered in a large format on celluloid. So obviously, what that means is that if the filmmaking team is willing to prioritize these pillars of the project, then it can be done. And after many years of being told that it couldn't be done, or that's not the way that we do things around here, essentially. I would sort of like to, I'd like to revise that, and I'd like to see some real reform in the world of independent cinema, which is really my area.
Yeah.
I can't really speak to the studio system. I have no intention of directing a franchise after this. I will continue making my own films forever and in perpetuity.
Yeah. I mean, that question of what are your pillars? What are you going to spend money on? What are you going to compromise on? I feel like is such an essential part of making any kind of film for yourself. And to me, I feel like that's where the nervousness around AI specifically comes in, about people saying oh, well, we're just going to cut humans out of the process. And that's what you were able to not do on The Brutalist. But the technology keeps changing. These shortcuts keep presenting themselves to you. And how do you gut check? How do you figure out what does make sense to cut? What do you build? What do you not build? How have you gotten to that point?
I think that's pretty straightforward.
Oh, really?
Yeah. I mean, I think that ethical use of technology and new technologies is it's pretty obvious. I mean, obviously, over the last couple of weeks, there's been a lot of conversation about the fact that we used a company called Respeecher, which, employs the assistance of AI to make all of the Hungarian dialogue in our film perfect.
Yeah.
Because, for example, we have foreign actors, like if we think about someone like Penelope Cruz or someone who's worked in America for, decades, and has a beautiful accent that I absolutely love. But like to play an American,
Sure.
that was born and raised in America would be very tricky. So, our actors had to learn how to speak Hungarian because otherwise, the technology wouldn't work, wouldn't function. But we went in and dialogue edited with the assistance of this technology so that they would speak Hungarian without an American and English accent, respectively. The other thing is that the company that we worked with, that's based in Kiev, Ukraine, is an extraordinary company made up of a lot of young people. It's manual labor that took many engineers working around the clock to make it function, even though it's only a few minutes of the film's entire runtime. And essentially, Adrian and Felicity's vocal models, they now own, in perpetuity. So
is that how they always do it, or did you guys have to negotiate for that?
That was what was important to me.
Yeah.
And it was what was important to Reese Beecher. Because essentially it will allow our cast, if anyone tries to use their vocal likeness to sell, a Buick,
Sure.
then there will actually be a way for them to pursue being compensated for that.
Yeah.
Or obviously, having that company cease and desist.
Yeah.
So, I don't use technology to cut corners. I use whatever the best tool is available to me to make my films as authentic as they can be. And I actually think that perhaps people are having the somewhat wrong conversation around this because for me, representation really matters. And if the nation of Hungary were, coming out and saying, hey, these characters that are supposed to be from this place, have very small flaws in their dialect. They give it away that they were born and raised in America and England, that would be its own controversy.
Yeah.
So the reality is that we can't please everyone, and you just have to sort of do what you believe is right and righteous for your project. And, the rest is just noise that you have to tune out.
Yeah.
And so, one thing that I'm kind of happy about, is that this company that's based out of Kiev is getting so much attention because they're really brilliant and they were extraordinary collaborators, and we worked very closely with them. My mixer Steve, who mixes Justin Kurzel's movies and mixed Tar for Todd Field, and he's mixed a lot of extraordinary films. Yeah. He and I would spend, sometimes 22 hours in the studio getting these things to sound exactly right. So I think that for me, what would be unethical is, are we eliminating jobs? That's a problem for me. Are we, if that's the shortcut, if it doesn't require like a human being, then I think that's really problematic. I mean, obviously, I know that there's a lot of artists that feel differently. I know that Paul Schrader has recently come out and talked about how he loves the idea of, AI supporting him as a writer. And, I think it's important that we live in a day and age where people are able to express very radical thoughts. And even though I personally, as a writer, disagree, I really respect that he, has taken that very controversial position, simply because of the fact that we live in a world right now where people jump to conclusions so quickly. And my biggest concern is that, everyone is never going to want to come out of the shadows. They're not going to want to have a dialogue in public about anything that is potentially deemed controversial. And I think that's really bad for journalism. Because it means that, the interviewees are going to stop being honest.
Well, that happens all the time, believe me.
Totally. And I think it's, and that of course, I think is bad for the culture.
Yeah.
And so, something that artists that I, personally really respect and admire, like Mr. Paul Schrader, we need those figures. We need the Zizeks, and we need the Lars von Triers, and we need the sort of outside of the box, troublemakers out there, because otherwise we're going to sand everything down, and there's going to be nothing left to talk about.
Yeah. Is that what you hope you can be as you kind of get used to, doing 6 months of press for your movie?
I am not personally interested in being the face of my productions. On this film, I really have no other choice, because there were so many viewers that are unfamiliar with my body of work. And I think so much of this campaign is about introducing the public to the team. But, if I had it my way, of course, I would just let my films speak for themselves, because, it's the difference between having an argument and taking the time to write a thoughtful letter or email to someone where, a film is something where you've considered absolutely everything that's gone into it. And usually when I'm doing an interview, I've just stepped off a plane. I'm generally underslept because you're on a promotional tour.
Yeah.
And so, you have every opportunity to misspeak, or say something completely asinine, or something, you might even say something you plainly don't mean, because you're frustrated or annoyed, that whoever you're speaking with seems to be making a point of misunderstanding what it is that you're trying to say. So I think that in general, I do think that, my work, and certainly what I'm working on right now, my next project, is really engaging with a lot of I would say, the more controversial topics and themes of our time.
Okay.
And so, I can, in an ideal world, I'll be able to put that out into the world, and we'll do a few press conferences, and then the rest of my team, they can step into the limelight and really speak about it if they want to. But I absolutely understand why Terrence Malick does not do that. I understand why, Scott Walker, my composer of many years, would only do about 2 or 3 interviews when he had an album coming out. And I think especially in this day and age, I can't imagine Scott would even do 1 or 2, and so, it's just not my...
You're very good at it. You're good at speaking on behalf of your films, even if you would prefer not to.
That's very kind. I really appreciate that. But, if I wanted to be, the center of attention, I would make myself the center of attention. And so, I've been fortunate enough to speak to enough established filmmakers that are also going through this process. And they're like, don't worry. Like, in a few months, you will go back to the relative anonymity that you really cherish.
Yeah.
And because I'm not getting dressed in a bodysuit and going out on stage every night. What I'm trying to do is engage with real conversations and not be evasive, because I think it's very important, culturally speaking, for us not to be. But of course, you are constantly a bird on a wire, and so it's very it's very challenging. It's challenging to mentally never be able to rest. I wake up at 7:30 in the morning sometimes, and I have to be prepared to speak on the most politically charged topics of our day at 8 a.m.
Yeah.
And I think that that is a major responsibility, and I'm not a politician. I'm not a philosopher even. I am merely a filmmaker, and I have themes that I'm devoted to, and my work is sort of unpicking and unpacking those themes. But for me, it's really as simple as that.
Yeah.
One thing I was speaking to I was speaking to my friend who's a filmmaker and a painter, a very well-regarded one, Julian
I
Schnabel.
was just going to say, like, I don't know too many well-regarded painter filmmakers. It has to be him.
And so Julian, we were in a studio and we were looking at this big, beautiful painting he just finished. And he said, you know what I love about painting is that I don't have to tell anybody what it means. And he was like, I know what it means, but I don't have to tell anybody what it means. And I think a lot of artists feel like that. I think a lot of artists feel like with such a reactionary public, so frequently, the result of that could be that we end up with no daring or provocative cinema. And that is 99% of what gets made. So it's a strange thing that so many projects that are like come under attack that are really not, in my opinion, the right projects to try and kneecap.
Yeah.
Because we're predominantly most of the films that are in the conversation this year are independent movies. I mean, Anora is a real independent movie, and many of the films that are in the selection this year were films that the filmmakers really had to struggle to get them made and sort of protect the flame of their project.
Yeah.
And so, whether you love them or hate them, whether you love my film or hate my films, I think that they absolutely have a right to exist. And to come to some sort of a conclusion, this entire film is about a character that's fighting for their project's right to exist. And it's about a character that's fighting for their family's right to exist in this community. And so that is the reason that I see parallels between the immigrant experience and the artistic one. Yeah. I mean, not to mention that, of course, the reality behind Brutalist Design's history is that it was predominantly, immigrant architects that were out of the Bauhaus. They were Central and European immigrants. So,
I know. Well, you're making me think of Laszlo Toth in the final scene being silent at the tribute. And it's just like, yes, that's the way to do it. You let everyone see your work and you don't have to say a word.
I mean, the poor guy has led a really hard life. I mean, it's funny because, when the character's supposed to have, visibly, you see that the character's recently had a stroke. Yeah. And, there was an initial question on set of, the character's only 80 years old, but he really looks like ancient in this scene.
They looked hard back then.
Yeah, but I was like, well, have you seen Chet Baker at 57?
Yeah. We don't see him treating his body well in this movie. I think
he looks like King Tut.
One last question before I know you have to go. What are you doing March 3rd? Have you figured out what you get to do when you take a deep breath?
I'm going to go home. I'm going to go home. I'm going to be with my daughter.
Yeah. I didn't know if you were going to take her to Disneyland or something and get out of there.
Oh my God. Disneyland that's where I've been for the last 6 months, essentially. So I need a break. I need a long break from all this noise.
Yeah, go sit and stare at a wall for a while.
Motion. I'm going to meditate. I'm going to do yoga. I'm going to drink tea.
Oh, that sounds great.
And I'm going to, reflect on everything that's transpired in the last 7 or 8 years that we've been working on this project. Because finally, every time I think it's done, it's never done, but it will finally be done.
Yeah. That does it for today's episode. This podcast is edited by Brett Fuchs and produced by Brett Fuchs and me. Our theme music is by Dave Gonzalez. Thanks again to my co-host, Joanna Robinson. Subscribe to the Prestige Junkie newsletter at theankler.com and subscribe to this podcast on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. We'll have a lot of episodes between now and the end of Oscar voting, so we'll see you on Tuesday.